Today we are going to talk about freedom. And in a moment we're going to think together about just one verse from the Bible, and that's from Galatians chapter 5 verse 1, and it goes like this: "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Now, you might be watching this thinking, Christianity? Freedom? How can a religion based on ancient rules and moral codes be about freedom? Isn't religion anti-freedom? Isn't it oppressive? Well, if that is you, and perhaps that's your experience, thank you for watching. Perhaps someone you know has forwarded this to you and you're now wondering whether they're as loopy as you first thought they were. Well, hang on there with me, if you will, just for a few minutes, and let's see how we get on as we explore freedom together. Because whatever your views on the Christian faith, freedom is something many of us have been thinking about more than ever recently. The national lockdown has meant many of us have had our personal freedoms restricted in a way that we've never experienced before, certainly not in this part of the world. And that has been a struggle. None of us like losing the ability not to be free to go and to come back as we please. The freedom to work, the freedom to socialise. And of course, just a couple of weeks ago, our Prime Minister laid out a roadmap to freedom. Hooray! I can't wait. But even when we get there, wherever there is, will we be truly free? What do we mean by freedom anyway? Why is it so important? Why is it so complicated, it seems, and problematic? Why do certain kinds of freedoms seem to bring so many difficulties with them? And what would happen if God gave us an alternative freedom that was better than any other freedom we could experience? So many questions, and I have all the freedom that 15 minutes gives me to begin to explore them with you. So let's begin by underlining the importance of freedom. Because of course there are freedoms that people have fought and died for, to gain and to maintain. Political freedom and freedom of speech, they're precious. There are things that we are at liberty to do, which many around the world today are not free to do. And wherever we are, our hearts yearn for freedom when we're trapped, when we're oppressed or afflicted in any way. But it is complicated. As someone once said, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. And some of this comes down to what we mean by freedom. What kind of freedom are we after? Well, it's important to realise that our very idea of what freedom is has hugely evolved over human history, and particularly in the last 300 years. Where once freedom was tied closely to national or religious identity and its obligations, philosophical thought has changed, particularly here in Western society. Thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Stuart Mills began to place the freedom of the individual person above the duty to a wider community or state. Happiness of the individual began to become more and more important and considered the dominant pursuit in life. Literature and art followed, pushing through with this desire to see fulfillment that is found in throwing off the constraints and expectations of society. So through the Romantic era, the modern, and now the postmodern, the focus has become increasingly about defining ourselves as individuals, over and above any other wider influences. And this lies at the heart of what is often called Western individualism, where freedom equals being free from the constraints that others put on me, whatever those constraints may be. Just look at the message of so many of our films today. Last Christmas, Disney Pixar released their latest amazing animated film called Soul. Its central character, Joe, voiced by Jamie Foxx, is a jazz pianist, and he longs to be a performing musician. And Joe throws off every expectation from his family. He ignores the need to make money or to be respectable in order to pursue this dream of playing in the jazz clubs of New York, where he finds freedom as he plays the music that he loves. That and the common themes that's the theme of most Disney movies, isn't it? But there's real nuance and self-reflection in this beautiful film. When Joe arrives, when by a series of hard-won circumstances and fortunate circumstances, he gets to play with a leading jazz group, when he does, he's left feeling, now what? He's left unsatisfied. Now, I won't spoil the film any further and tell you how Disney resolve this tension, what solution they give to this dissatisfaction. But it's enough to say that the film identifies that this pursuit of this kind of freedom, the throwing off of external constraints others put on us to pursue personal happiness and dreams, it is problematic. Because this very definition of freedom, being free from the constraints of others, pitches us against others. When it's individual freedom above all else, it is the people around us who are left out, left behind, sidelined, and perhaps most likely used in order to pursue that freedom. This kind of freedom pits us against our neighbours. For example, our so-called freedom to buy cheap clothing for our own benefit costs those who are poorly paid, who are usually out of sight and out of mind on the other side of the world. And when you have millions of individuals pursuing that kind of freedom, society is a mess. Too often the pursuit of this kind of freedom is an excuse for greed. It causes hurt, it stirs up anger. And like Joe in the film, even when the individual were to get there, to this position of freedom, it doesn't actually feel like freedom. And it leaves that person unsatisfied, leaving a trail of hurt and broken relationships behind them. So in response, many might say, across the world right now and through history, that is why wider society must be put first. Community is more important than the individual. And that's the mindset we find in more traditional cultures and religious communities. But even that's problematic, because too often, because of our human tendency towards greed and wanting more power for ourselves or for our particular tribe or our ethnicity or our grouping, we too often see oppression and discrimination around us. People become slaves to duty, and often enslaved to a system that makes them feel like they're just a cog in a giant, unyielding machine. And so again, our hearts yearn for freedom. Now, we've felt this tension during lockdown, haven't we? We've been asked to curtail our personal freedoms for the sake of others. Our individual freedoms have been cut back so that we can serve and protect our wider society. But that has been costly. And we can't go on like this forever. We long to be free. But I wonder, even if we're free to do whatever we want to do, would we really be free? Left to our own devices, most of us, and I include myself in this, find ourselves enslaved to our own bad habits and our wonky desires. So what should we do? How can we be truly set free in a way that allows us to thrive as an individual on the inside and the outside, and that doesn't pit us against our neighbours? Well, let's go back to that Bible verse that I read at the beginning, Galatians 5, chapter 1. it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. The answer to true freedom comes in the good news of Jesus Christ. This gospel, this good news, as we find it described in a myriad of ways in the Bible, sets us truly free. That is because the gospel understands this, that we, you and I, are more enslaved by our own inner desires than we realise. It's not primarily constraints others put on us, or even that God puts on us, that trap us. It's the things our heart's desire makes us want to pursue, whether it's money, sex, power, or the more suburban equivalents of a mortgage, well-educated children, and a good holiday. We tend to believe that those will bring us happiness, and indeed when we obtain what we want, those are the things that are going to free us. But it's a lie. And as we've already explored, it either pitches us against others as we are trying to achieve those desires as individuals, or we feel oppressed by a lack of those things in our lives because we've had to bury them for the sake of a wider society or culture or even family. We're enslaved on the inside before we are on the outside. But Christ came to set us free from that slavery and release us to free others around us. When you read the accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible, you see a man living in perfect freedom. Free from the enslaving desires of his heart, he was able to pursue what was on God, his Father's heart. He was free to serve others. So Jesus used all the power he was given by the Holy Spirit to free others from their physical, emotional, and spiritual bondage. And he did that principally by choosing to take upon himself those enslaving human desires that oppress us and oppress others, our sins. And he allowed those sins to restrict his own freedom, his own personal freedom, to the extent that he was the subject to violent oppression and torture. But as he died, he was winning freedom for the human race. Even death, the ultimate restrictor of freedom, was turned upside down by Jesus. He rose from the dead, his body freed from any decay, promising those that trust him could find freedom in this life and the next, just like him. Now, the Christians in the church in Galatia that St. Paul was writing to, they knew the freedom that came from believing in Jesus. They had received this gift of freedom from God and had been, they were living it out, and their community had been transformed by being freed from their selfish desires, free to love God and to love their neighbours, whether they liked them not or they were like them or not. Men, women, Jews, Gentiles, slave and free. They all experienced a unity as they never had done before, and a freedom to love one another that had ripple effects around their area and still does today in communities that trust Jesus. But there were some who could not understand this type of freedom that was happening in Galatia, because it took away the power from the religious institutions that their society had been held together for many times. And so they began to tell the people who had been freed by Jesus that they needed to adjust, that they should be conforming to the Jewish ways of living by following their laws. But St. Paul, writing in this letter to the Galatians, sees their error, and he's furious. Because it's only Christ that truly sets free. Faith in him alone, tying people to laws that are not their own, will enslave all of you, he says, setting up a hierarchy where there no longer needs to be one. These laws will only constrain the heart, not set it free. You see, if you're sat there dubious of religion because of its tendency to oppress, then you're not alone. So was St. Paul. The freedom that Jesus Christ offers comes neither through individualistic pursuit nor by suppressing our individuality for the sake of a society, a culture, or a religious tradition. Jesus is someone altogether different and beyond those streams. And a relationship with him will enable true happiness and a better society, freeing us from the inner pains, desires, and evils that enslave us, and releasing us in the power of his Spirit to free those around us as we tell them about Jesus, the gift he is to them, and as we demonstrate his love to them. Listen, if you're watching this, you've got to realise that you're in control of how you want to respond. You're free to do as you want. You might now want to press pause, and reflect on the freedom that Jesus is offering you today. You may wish to chat to someone in your household to talk through some of the issues about freedom that I've attempted to raise. Or you may wish to just plunge straight into a worship song that celebrates our freedom in Jesus. Whatever you do, may you know the freedom of Christ this week.